A tech millionaire's pregnant wife live streams her perfect life to 50,000 followers. But when her stream cuts to black, viewers catch pure terror in her eyes as her husband's voice explodes off camera. Hours later, she's bleeding in a hospital emergency room. The surgeon treating her wounds is her billionaire godfather, who discovers a shocking conspiracy. Hit like and subscribe for this incredible story that will keep you on edge. The ring light cast a warm glow over Sarah Chen Williams as she smiled into her phone camera, her 7-month pregnant belly perfectly framed by the marble kitchen island. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Manhattan penthouse showcase the glittering city skyline. "Hey, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Sarah's sanctuary," she chirped, whisking eggs in a crystal bowl. "Today, we're making my grandmother's famous vanilla souffle, perfect for date night with my amazing husband Brandon." The comments flooded in. Heart emojis. Fire emojis. Thousands of followers living vicariously through her seemingly perfect life. Sarah had built her brand around being the ultimate wife and soon-to-be mother, sharing recipes, pregnancy tips, and glimpses into her luxurious lifestyle. "Brandon surprised me yesterday with the most gorgeous nursery furniture," she continued, her voice honey-sweet for her audience. "I cannot wait for you all to see the reveal next week when baby Mitchell finally arrives." She moved gracefully around the kitchen, her designer maternity dress flowing as she demonstrated proper folding technique. At 29, Sarah had everything women her age dreamed of. A successful tech millionaire husband, a penthouse apartment worth millions, and a social media following that hung on her every word. "Remember, ladies, the secret to a happy marriage is making your husband feel like the king of his castle," she said, sliding the soufflé into the professional-grade oven. "When our men feel appreciated and—" The crash came from behind the camera, something heavy hitting the floor, followed by Brandon's voice, sharp and angry. "Sarah, what the hell did you do with my files?" Her smile flickered for just a moment. The comments started coming faster now, viewers asking if everything was okay. Sarah's laugh tinkled like wind chimes, but her eyes had gone flat. "Oh my goodness, looks like someone's having a Monday," she said to the camera. "Let me just go help my busy husband find whatever he's looking for." She moved toward the camera to end the stream, but Brandon's voice cut through again, closer now and louder. "Don't you dare lie to me about going through my office. I know you were snooping around my computer last night." The camera caught Sarah's face in profile, and for a split second, her mask slipped completely. Terror. Pure, undiluted terror flashed across her features before she managed to tap the screen. "So sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties. Love you all. See you tomorrow." The stream went black, but it was too late. In those final seconds, over 50,000 viewers had seen what Sarah Chen Williams never wanted anyone to see. The cracks in her perfect life, the fear in her eyes, the way her hand instinctively moved to protect her belly when her husband's voice rose. Within minutes, screen recordings would be circulating on social media. Comment sections would explode with concern and speculation. Sarah's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, and she had no idea that this moment of exposed vulnerability would set in motion events that would either destroy her completely or finally set her free. The soufflé continued to rise in the oven, golden and perfect, while Sarah's marriage began its final, catastrophic collapse just a few feet away. 4 hours later, Sarah Chen Williams stumbled through the automatic doors of Manhattan General Hospital, her designer maternity dress torn at the shoulder and blood trickling from a gash above her left eyebrow. The pristine marble floors seemed to spin beneath her feet as she gripped the reception desk for support. "Please, I need help," she whispered to the triage nurse, her voice barely audible above the constant hum of medical equipment and urgent conversations. Nurse Patricia Johnson looked up from her computer screen and immediately reached for the emergency protocols. 23 years in emergency medicine had taught her to recognize the signs, even when they came wrapped in $1,000 clothing and diamond jewelry. "Ma'am, what happened? How far along are you?" 7 months, Sarah said, her hand instinctively covering her belly. "I fell down the stairs outside our building. So clumsy of me, especially being this pregnant. I just lost my footing and tumbled down about 5 steps." The explanation came out rehearsed, practiced. Patricia had heard variations of this story hundreds of times before, always delivered with the same apologetic tone that suggested the victim somehow deserved their injuries. "Okay, honey, let's get you into a room and take a look at that head wound. Were you alone when this happened?" Before Sarah could answer, the hospital doors burst open with dramatic flair. Brandon Mitchell strode in wearing his signature charcoal suit, his face the perfect picture of concerned husband. At 35, he commanded attention wherever he went, his tech startup success story having made him a minor celebrity in New York business circles. "Sarah, thank God," he called out, loud enough for everyone in the waiting area to hear. "I told you to wait for me before going downstairs. The stairs in our building are so steep, and with her pregnancy affecting her balance." He shook his head ruefully, addressing Patricia as if Sarah weren't standing right there. "She's been having these dizzy spells lately. I keep telling her to be more careful, but you know how independent pregnant women can be. They think they can still do everything themselves." Patricia watched the interaction with practiced eyes. Brandon's performance was flawless, concerned, slightly frustrated, but ultimately loving. If she hadn't spent over 2 decades seeing these same dynamics play out, she might have believed it. "Sir, I need to examine your wife privately. Hospital policy for all head injuries involving pregnant patients." Brandon's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, but I hope you understand my concern. Sarah has been under a lot of stress lately with the pregnancy and her social media work. Sometimes stress can make people unsteady." The subtle implication hung in the air. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame as she realized Brandon was already laying the groundwork for his narrative. If anyone questioned her injuries, he had established that she was stressed, unbalanced, and prone to accidents. "Mr. Mitchell, you can wait in the family area. We'll update you as soon as possible." As Patricia led Sarah toward the examination area, she noticed how the young woman kept glancing back at her husband, as if seeking permission for each step. The fear in her eyes wasn't about her injuries, it was about what might happen if she said the wrong thing. "Room 7, Patricia said, pulling the curtain closed with practiced efficiency. "Now then, let's take a real look at what happened tonight." Sarah perched on the edge of the examination bed, her hands trembling as she touched the bandage Patricia had applied to her forehead. For the first time in hours, she felt like she could breathe without measuring each inhalation against Brandon's expectations. "The cut isn't too deep," Patricia said gently, "but it's going to need stitches. Can you tell me exactly how you fell?" The question seemed simple enough, but Sarah's mouth went dry. The truth sat on her tongue like acid. Brandon hadn't just pushed her down 5 stairs after she'd questioned him about the mysterious files on his computer. He'd grabbed her shoulders and shoved her hard when she tried to walk away from their argument. "I missed my footing," she said instead, the lie feeling heavier with each repetition. "Brandon was right behind me, trying to help, but I was already falling." Patricia nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't buying the story. She'd seen too many falls that resulted in the specific pattern of injuries Sarah displayed. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask, do you feel safe at home?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. 6 months ago, she would have answered without hesitation. Yes, of course she felt safe. Brandon loved her, provided for her, gave her everything any woman could want. But now, sitting in this sterile hospital room with stitches in her scalp and her unborn baby moving restlessly in her womb, Sarah realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly safe anywhere. "Yes," she whispered anyway. "Brandon takes very good care of me." But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah wondered if she was trying to convince Patricia or herself. The emergency room's familiar chaos continued around them when Patricia returned with unexpected news. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's been a change in your case assignment. Dr. Richard Sterling has requested to take over your care. He was finishing surgery when your case came in." Sarah's heart stopped for a full beat, then began racing so fast she was sure the monitors would start screaming. "Dr. Richard Sterling. Uncle Richard. The man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with calculus homework. The billionaire cardiac surgeon who had built his fortune through both medical brilliance and shrewd investments. Her godfather, whom she hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. The curtain slid open, and Dr. Sterling stepped inside. At 58, he still commanded attention without demanding it, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent light. His pale blue eyes immediately found Sarah's with the same intensity that had made him one of the most respected surgeons on the East Coast. "Sarah Elizabeth," he said quietly, his Boston accent still faintly coloring his words. "My God, what happened to you?" The childhood nickname hit Sarah like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had said her name with such genuine concern? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen Sarah, not Brandon Mitchell's pregnant wife, or the perfectly curated social media influencer, Uncle Richard? She whispered, using the name she'd called him since childhood. "I didn't know you were working tonight." Richard approached the bed with careful steps, his trained eyes cataloging details with surgical precision. The cut on her forehead was clean but deep. The way she held her left shoulder suggested defensive positioning. The slight bruising around her wrist looked several days old. "I was finishing a procedure when they called about a domestic situation," he said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it in years. "I never imagined I'd find you here. Sweetheart." The endearment made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be called sweetheart, as comfort rather than manipulation. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, the words automatic after months of practice. "I fell down some stairs. Brandon was right there trying to help me. I've just been so clumsy lately with the pregnancy and everything." Richard pulled up the rolling stool and sat down so his eyes were level with hers. It was a gesture she remembered from childhood, when he would lower himself to her height to discuss scraped knees or hurt feelings with the same seriousness he brought to life or death medical decisions. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I've been treating trauma patients for 35 years. I know what fall injuries look like, and I know what assault injuries look like." The clinical assessment hit her like cold water. For months, Brandon had been so careful to make her question her own perceptions, to doubt her own memories. But Richard was looking at her injuries with professional eyes that couldn't be manipulated or gaslit. "This bruising on your wrist is at least 3 days old." Richard continued. "The cut on your head came from impact with a sharp edge, not from tumbling downstairs. And the way you're protecting your left side suggests this isn't the first time you've been hurt." Sarah's hands moved instinctively to cover her belly, as if she could shield her unborn daughter from hearing these words. "You don't understand. Marriage is complicated. Brandon's been under tremendous stress with his business, and I've been emotional lately. Sometimes I overreact to things. How long has this been happening?" The question hung between them like a bridge Sarah wasn't sure she had the courage to cross. How do you tell the man who taught you to believe in yourself that you've become someone you don't recognize? Someone who apologizes for breathing too loudly. "It's not happening," she whispered, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Brandon loves me. He takes care of me. I have everything any woman could want." Richard reached for her medical chart, scanning it with focused attention. "According to this, you've been in emergency rooms 3 times in the past 6 months. Sprained wrist from falling off a curb, bruised ribs from slipping in the shower, and now this head injury from falling downstairs. Sarah, that's not clumsiness. That's a pattern." The documentation felt like evidence in a trial she wasn't ready to face. Each incident had seemed isolated when it happened, easily explained by Brandon's reasonable voice telling her she was becoming unsteady, emotional, accident-prone. But seeing them listed together in cold medical terminology made them look exactly like what they were: a escalating series of assaults. "I should trust him to handle our problems," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I ask too many questions about things that aren't my business." "Like what? Like credit card statements and phone calls and why he needs to work so late so often." The words tumbled out before Sarah could stop them. "But he's right. Those things aren't my concern. I should trust him without interfering." Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same intensity he brought to examining surgical scans. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of experience with victims who'd been systematically broken down. "The Sarah I raised would never accept that explanation," he said. "The Sarah I know would ask questions about anything that affected her life. What happened to that woman?" The question hit Sarah like a scalpel, cutting straight through to the heart of her pain. She'd been asking herself the same thing for months. When had she stopped trusting her own instincts? When had she started apologizing for having thoughts and feelings? When had she learned to make herself smaller and quieter to avoid triggering Brandon's anger? Before she could answer, footsteps approached and Brandon's voice announced his presence through the curtain. "Sarah, honey, are you doing okay in there? The nurses won't tell me anything, and I'm getting worried." Richard stood up, his full presence creating a barrier between Sarah and the approaching confrontation. When Brandon stepped inside, his expression immediately shifted from concerned husband to deferential businessman, recognizing someone whose wealth and influence dwarfed his own. The game was about to change, and Sarah found herself caught between the 2 most powerful men in her life, unsure whether this moment would save her or destroy her completely. Brandon's transformation was immediate and startling. The moment he recognized Dr. Richard Sterling, his entire demeanor shifted like an actor switching roles mid-performance. Gone was the controlling husband. In his place stood a charming businessman, eager to make a good impression. "Dr. Sterling?" Brandon's voice rose with manufactured enthusiasm. "What an incredible honor. I had no idea you were working tonight. I'm Brandon Mitchell, Sarah's husband. We met briefly at the Children's Hospital fundraising gala last spring." Richard's response was politely professional but noticeably cool. "I remember. Please explain to me how your pregnant wife ended up bleeding in my emergency room." Brandon launched into his prepared narrative with the polish of someone who had rehearsed the story multiple times. Sarah's pregnancy had made her emotional and unsteady. She'd been having what he diplomatically called episodes of irrational behavior. Tonight, she'd stormed out of their apartment after an argument about something trivial, and in her emotional state, She'd missed her footing on the exterior stairs. "I was right behind her, trying to calm her down," Brandon said, his voice carrying just the right note of frustrated concern. "But you know how pregnant women can be. The hormones make them unpredictable. I've been trying to get her to see someone about the mood swings, but she refuses to admit there's a problem." Sarah felt herself shrinking as Brandon painted her as an unstable, emotional woman who couldn't be trusted to navigate basic daily activities. The worst part was how reasonable he made it sound. How he positioned himself as the long-suffering husband dealing with a wife who had become a liability. "Is that what happened, Sarah?" Richard asked, his eyes finding hers across the small space. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth sat in her throat like a stone, but Brandon's presence made it impossible to speak. She could feel his expectations pressing against her like a physical weight, demanding that she confirm his version of events. "She's been having trouble with reality lately," Brandon continued when Sarah hesitated. "Imagining conflicts that didn't happen, accusing me of things that never occurred. Her therapist thinks it might be pregnancy-related anxiety, but I'm starting to worry it's something more serious." The suggestion that she was losing touch with reality hit Sarah like a slap. For months, Brandon had been subtly undermining her confidence in her own perceptions. Now he was doing it in front of the one person whose opinion still mattered to her. Richard nodded slowly, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he might actually believe Brandon's explanation. Her heart sank as she imagined being dismissed as another hysterical pregnant woman whose hormones had made her an unreliable witness to her own life. "That's certainly possible," Richard said carefully. "Pregnancy can affect cognitive function and emotional regulation. We should definitely run some tests to rule out any underlying conditions." Brandon's smile was triumphant, but Sarah caught something in Richard's expression that suggested this conversation was far from over. There was a calculating look in his pale blue eyes that reminded her of the way he used to appear when working through particularly complex surgical problems. "In fact," Richard continued, "I think Sarah should stay overnight for observation. Head injuries can be unpredictable, especially in pregnant patients. We need to monitor her for signs of concussion and make sure the baby isn't showing any stress responses to the trauma." "That's not necessary," Brandon said quickly. "Sarah will be more comfortable at home, in familiar surroundings. I can keep an eye on her myself." "I'm afraid I have to insist," Richard replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "As her attending physician, I'm responsible for her care while she's in this hospital. My medical opinion is that she needs professional monitoring for the next 24 hours. Sarah watched the two men face off across her hospital bed, understanding that they were having a conversation that went far beyond medical necessity. Brandon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she recognized the warning signs of his anger beginning to build. "Dr. Sterling," Brandon said, his voice still pleasant but with an edge Sarah had learned to fear. "I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think you're being overly cautious. Sarah has always been prone to dramatic interpretations of minor incidents. A night in the hospital will just feed into her tendency toward hypochondria." "Nevertheless," Richard replied firmly, "she's staying." As if summoned by the rising tension, Patricia appeared at the curtain opening. "Dr. Sterling, there's a phone call for you at the nurses' station. They said it was urgent." Richard looked reluctant to leave, but nodded. "I'll be right back. Sarah, don't go anywhere." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Brandon moved closer to Sarah's bed. His concerned husband mask slipped just enough for her to see the cold anger underneath. "What did you tell him?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of a threat. "Nothing," Sarah whispered back. "I told him exactly what you said happened." "Good," Brandon said, but his eyes remained hard. Because if you start filling his head with your paranoid fantasies, it's going to cause problems for both of us. Doctor, Sterling is a powerful man in this city. We don't want to make an enemy of him over your emotional instability. Sarah nodded, but something fundamental had shifted during her conversation with Richard. For the first time in months, someone had looked at her injuries with professional eyes and seen what she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Someone had asked the questions she'd been afraid to answer. In the distance, a phone was ringing with news that would change everything. But in this moment, Sarah Chen Williams was beginning to remember what it felt like to have someone in her corner, someone who might actually fight for her instead of trying to control her. The war for Sarah's freedom was about to begin, and she was finally ready to stop fighting on the wrong side. When Richard returned from his phone call 20 minutes later, his expression was grim. Brandon had spent the interim whispering threats disguised as reassurances, reminding Sarah of everything she stood to lose if she misrepresented their marriage to her godfather. "Sarah," Richard said, settling back onto the rolling stool, "I need to tell you something. That phone call was from Detective James Cooper. He's been investigating irregularities in your husband's business dealings." Brandon's face went carefully blank, but Sarah caught the flash of panic in his eyes before he recovered his composure. "What kind of irregularities?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "Financial crimes, wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering," Richard said, watching Brandon's reaction closely. "Detective Cooper has been building a case for months. He asked me to keep you safe tonight because he believes you might be in danger." The words hit Sarah like ice water. Everything she'd suspected about Brandon's late nights, mysterious phone calls, and secretive business trips crystallized into terrifying clarity. She wasn't just married to an abuser, she was married to a criminal. "That's absolutely ridiculous," Brandon said, his voice rising slightly. "Some small-minded detective is obviously trying to build a reputation by targeting successful entrepreneurs. Sarah knows I run a legitimate business." But Sarah was remembering things now. The way Brandon's mood had been deteriorating over recent months, his increasing paranoia about her questions, the way he'd started talking about handling problems and protecting their future. "Dr. Sterling," Brandon continued, his tone becoming more aggressive, "I hope you're not planning to involve my wife in some fishing expedition based on wild accusations from a detective with an agenda." Richard stood up, his surgeon's calm providing stark contrast to Brandon's growing agitation. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, Detective Cooper will be here shortly to speak with Sarah. Apparently, she's listed as a co-signer on several business accounts that are central to his investigation." Sarah's blood turned cold. "What accounts, Brandon? I never signed anything for your business." "You signed hundreds of documents over the years," Brandon snapped, momentarily forgetting to maintain his concerned husband facade. "Marriage papers, insurance forms, bank authorizations. You can't expect to remember every piece of paperwork." But Sarah did remember. She remembered Brandon always handling their finances, always insisting she didn't need to worry about business details. She remembered signing documents he said were just formalities without reading them carefully. Documents he'd presented during romantic dinners or when she was distracted or tired. "You forged my signature," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Don't be ridiculous," Brandon said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're obviously confused. The stress of the pregnancy and your head injury are affecting your memory." Before anyone could respond, footsteps approached and Detective James Cooper appeared at the curtain opening. At 45, he had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades chasing white-collar criminals through corporate mazes. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, showing his badge. "I'm Detective Cooper. I need to speak with you about your husband's business activities." Sarah looked at Detective Cooper and felt the first flutter of real hope she'd experienced in months. Finally, someone with actual authority was asking questions about Brandon's behavior. Someone who might be able to protect her and her baby from whatever storm was coming. "Detective," she said, "I'd be happy to help with whatever you need to know." Cooper's expression was sympathetic as he pulled out a small recording device. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand that you're not under investigation. Based on what we've discovered, you appear to be a victim of financial fraud as well as domestic abuse. But I need to ask you some difficult questions about transactions that were made using your identity." Sarah felt Brandon's eyes boring into her, but for the first time in months, she didn't care about his approval or disapproval. She was tired of being afraid, tired of protecting someone who had never protected her. "What do you want to know?" she asked. Cooper opened his notebook and began reading. "Over the past 18 months, approximately $2.7 million has been transferred from accounts bearing your signature to offshore companies that don't appear to exist. Did you authorize these transfers?" The number hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. Nearly $3 million. Money that could have secured their daughter's future, stolen and hidden by the man who claimed to love them both. "I never authorized anything like that," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I didn't even know those accounts existed." "You're confused," Brandon interjected desperately. "Those were legitimate business investments we discussed. You agreed to everything." "Mr. Mitchell," Cooper said calmly, "I'm going to need you to step outside while I interview your wife. This is an active criminal investigation, and you're currently a person of interest." The mask finally slipped completely. Brandon's carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the rage and desperation underneath. "You have no right to interrogate my wife without my presence," he snarled. "This is harassment, plain and simple. Sarah, don't say another word to these people without a lawyer present." But Sarah was already talking, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. Months of suppressed questions, ignored intuitions, and silenced concerns finally finding their voice. She told Cooper about the mysterious phone calls, the business trips that never made sense, the way Brandon had systematically isolated her from their finances. She described the escalating abuse, the gaslighting, the way he'd made her question her own sanity. With each revelation, Brandon's desperation grew more apparent. The successful tech entrepreneur was disappearing before their eyes, replaced by a cornered criminal who was running out of options. But Sarah had no idea that her moment of courage was about to be turned against her in the most devastating way possible. Detective Cooper was listening to her confession with the attention of someone who cared about justice, but he was also calculating how to use her testimony for purposes that had nothing to do with protecting her. The first betrayal was about to reveal itself, and Sarah's brief moment of hope would soon crumble into her deepest despair yet. Detective Cooper listened to Sarah's testimony with what appeared to be genuine concern and professional attention. He asked follow-up questions, took detailed notes, and assured her that she was being incredibly brave by speaking out against her abuser. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said after recording nearly an hour of her statement, "what you've told me tonight confirms everything we suspected about your husband's criminal activities. With your testimony, we can build a case that will put him away for decades." Sarah felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. Finally, someone with authority was taking her seriously, someone who could actually protect her and her baby from Brandon's escalating violence and criminal schemes. "What happens next?" she asked. "Well," Cooper said, closing his notebook with what looked like satisfaction, That's where things get complicated. Something in his tone made Sarah's stomach clench with renewed anxiety. Richard, who had been quietly observing the interview, leaned forward with sharp attention. "Complicated how?" Richard asked. Cooper stood up and walked to the small window, his back to them as he spoke. "See, the thing about financial crimes this sophisticated is that they're never just about one person. Brandon's been working with some very dangerous people to launder money through his tech company. People who don't appreciate witnesses." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What kind of people?" Cooper turned around, and his expression had changed completely. The sympathetic detective had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. "The kind of people who've been paying me very well to keep an eye on this investigation," he said matter-of-factly. "The kind of people who would be very unhappy if your testimony made it to federal prosecutors." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The one person she'd thought could save her was actually working for the criminals who wanted to destroy her. "You're corrupt," Richard said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who'd spent his career saving lives only to watch this detective destroy them. "I prefer pragmatic," Cooper replied. "Brandon's little tech company has been washing money for a syndicate that controls most of the drug trade on the East Coast. They've invested heavily in keeping this operation quiet." Sarah felt her world crumbling around her. "How long have you been working with them?" "Long enough to know that you've become a serious problem," Cooper said. "Your husband was supposed to keep you under control. Your testimony tonight proves he's failed at that job." Brandon, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Detective, I told you I could handle Sarah. This is just a temporary setback. Give me a few more weeks, and she'll forget all about these paranoid theories." The casual way they discussed managing her like a business problem made Sarah feel sick. These men had been coordinating their efforts to silence her while she'd been desperately seeking help from the very system designed to protect her. "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation, Mr. Mitchell," Cooper said. "Your wife has now given a recorded statement detailing your criminal activities to what she believes is a legitimate police investigation. That recording is evidence that could destroy everything." Sarah looked at the recording device still sitting on her hospital bed, realizing it had captured not just her accusations against Brandon, but also Cooper's confession of police corruption and criminal conspiracy. "What are you going to do?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Cooper followed her gaze to the recording device, then smiled coldly. "Well, that depends on how reasonable you're willing to be. Mrs. Mitchell, you see, you've created a situation where everyone involved has something to lose." Richard stood up, positioning himself protectively between Cooper and Sarah. "Detective Cooper, I think you should leave now. Mrs. Mitchell is under my medical care, and I won't allow you to threaten her." Cooper laughed. "Dr. Sterling, I appreciate your concern for your goddaughter, but you're a cardiac surgeon, not a criminal defense attorney. You have no idea what you're dealing with here." The threat was clear. Cooper knew about the family connection, which meant he'd been investigating everyone in Sarah's life. There was nowhere she could run, no one she could trust, because the corruption went deeper than she'd imagined. "You have two choices, Mrs. Mitchell," Cooper continued. "You can forget this conversation ever happened. Go home with your husband and learn to appreciate the comfortable life he's provided for you. Or you can continue asking questions and find out what happens to people who interfere with business worth millions of dollars." Sarah looked around the hospital room that had briefly felt like a sanctuary. Brandon watched her with the satisfied expression of someone whose victory had just been assured. Cooper held all the cards, backed by criminals who could eliminate problems permanently. Even Richard, with all his wealth and influence, seemed powerless against this level of systematic corruption. "I need time to think," Sarah said quietly. "You have until tomorrow morning," Cooper replied. "After that, decisions will be made for you." As Cooper left the room, Sarah realized she was more trapped than ever. The police were corrupt, her husband was a criminal, and now she was carrying evidence that could get her killed. Her moment of courage had become her greatest mistake. But what Sarah didn't know was that Richard Sterling hadn't built his billion-dollar fortune by accepting defeat. While she'd been focused on Cooper's threats, her godfather had been making calculations of his own. The war for Sarah's freedom was far from over, and the next move would come from a direction none of them expected. The real battle was about to begin. The next morning brought a deceptive calm to Manhattan General Hospital. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing through impossible choices while her daughter moved restlessly in her womb. Richard had insisted on staying overnight, pulling strings to have a cot brought into her room despite hospital regulations. At 8 a.m., a woman Sarah didn't recognize appeared at her door, tall, blonde, and impeccably dressed. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "Sarah," the woman said with a warm smile, "I'm Maya Rodriguez. I work with Brandon at Mitchell Tech. I heard about your accident and wanted to check on you." Sarah recognized the name immediately. Maya was Brandon's assistant, the one who handled his travel arrangements and managed his schedule. But something about seeing her in person felt wrong. Maya was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 26, with the kind of polished beauty that belonged in boardrooms and exclusive restaurants. "That's very thoughtful," Sarah said cautiously, "but I'm feeling much better now." "I'm so glad to hear that," Maya said, settling into the visitor's chair as if she'd been invited. "Brandon has been beside himself with worry. He asked me to bring you these." She produced a bouquet of white roses, Sarah's favorites, though she couldn't remember ever telling Brandon about her preference for white flowers over red ones. "Actually," Maya continued, "I was hoping we could talk privately about Brandon's business and some concerns I've been having." Richard, who had stepped out to handle his morning rounds, wasn't there to witness what happened next. Sarah found herself leaning forward, hungry for information from someone who worked closely with her husband. "What kind of concerns?" Maya glanced around the room as if checking for listening devices, then pulled out her phone. "I've been documenting some troubling behavior for months now. I thought you should see this." The video that played on Maya's screen showed Sarah in their apartment, but not the Sarah she remembered being. This Sarah was wild-eyed and agitated, throwing books and shouting about Brandon's business trips. This Sarah looked unstable, paranoid, potentially dangerous. "I don't remember this," Sarah whispered, though even as she said it, fragments of memory surfaced. The night Brandon had come home from his Boston trip, her questions about his delayed flight, the argument that had spiraled out of control. "The stress of the pregnancy has been affecting you more than you realize," Maya said gently. "Brandon asked me to start documenting these episodes because he was worried about your mental state." More videos followed, Sarah searching frantically through Brandon's home office, Sarah confronting him about phone calls she'd overheard, Sarah accusing him of lying about his whereabouts. Each clip showed her at her worst moments, edited to remove context and make her appear increasingly unhinged. "He's been so worried about you," Maya continued, "especially after you started making accusations about financial irregularities. Sarah, I handle Brandon's accounts. I can show you every transaction. There's nothing suspicious about his business dealings." The evidence Maya presented was comprehensive and convincing. Bank statements showing legitimate business expenses, client contracts for real development projects, travel receipts that matched Brandon's claimed itinerary. Everything Sarah had questioned had reasonable explanations. "I've been paranoid," Sarah said quietly, the realization hitting her like a physical weight. "The pregnancy, the stress, the isolation. I've been seeing conspiracies where none existed." "It's not your fault," Maya said sympathetically. "Pregnancy can affect cognitive function and emotional regulation." "But Sarah, Detective Cooper's investigation is based on your accusations. If you recant your statement, admit that you were confused and emotional, this whole nightmare can end." For a moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief. She could take back her accusations, admit her mistakes, and return to her comfortable life. Brandon would forgive her emotional instability. The detective would close his investigation. Everything could go back to normal. But then Maya made a critical error. "Brandon and I have been working so hard to protect you from the consequences of your false accusations," she said. "We've been partners in this effort to save your reputation." Something in the way Maya said partners made Sarah's blood run cold. The intimacy in her voice when she spoke about Brandon, the possessive way she'd arranged the flowers, the expensive clothes and jewelry that seemed beyond an assistant's salary. "How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" Sarah asked quietly. Maya's expression didn't change, but her eyes went flat and cold. "I think you're having another one of your episodes, Sarah." "You're pregnant too, aren't you?" Sarah continued, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "That's why you're so invested in destroying my credibility. You want to replace me." Maya stood up, her sympathetic mask finally slipping. "You're delusional. This conversation proves exactly why Brandon needed to document your mental decline." But Sarah was remembering now, really remembering. The videos Maya had shown her were real, but they'd been taken out of context. Each confrontation had been preceded by Sarah discovering evidence of Brandon's lies. Each accusation had been based on genuine inconsistencies in his stories. "You've been helping him gaslight me," Sarah realized, "creating situations to make me look unstable, then recording my reactions." Maya smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw her true face, cold, calculating, completely without empathy. "Brandon chose me because I'm everything you're not," Maya said. "Young, stable, supportive. I don't ask inconvenient questions or make ridiculous accusations. I understand what it means to be a proper wife to a successful man." The revelation of Brandon's affair and Maya's pregnancy was devastating enough, but the systematic nature of their deception was what broke Sarah's heart. Every doubt she'd had about her own sanity, every moment she'd questioned her own perceptions, had been carefully orchestrated by the two people she'd trusted most. "Detective Cooper is going to love hearing about your latest paranoid fantasy," Maya continued. "This conversation proves you're too mentally unstable to be a credible witness about anything." But what Maya didn't know was that Richard had returned and was standing just outside the door, his phone recording every word of her confession. The trap Sarah had walked into was about to become Maya's downfall. The war was far from over, and Sarah was about to discover she had more allies than she realized. Richard Sterling had built his fortune by staying calm under pressure, but listening to Maya Rodriguez systematically destroy his goddaughter's sanity pushed him beyond his limits. The combination of professional outrage and personal fury created a perfect storm in his cardiovascular system that his 68-year-old heart couldn't withstand. The heart attack hit him as he stood outside Sarah's door, his phone still recording Maya's confession. The crushing chest pain sent him to his knees in the hospital corridor, and the irony wasn't lost on him that one of the world's most renowned cardiac surgeons was experiencing cardiac failure while trying to save the person he loved most. "Code Blue, Floor 7. echoed through the hospital speakers as Richard's colleagues rushed to save his life. Sarah heard the commotion but had no idea her godfather was fighting for his life just yards away. She was still reeling from Maya's revelations, trying to process the scope of the conspiracy against her. "Sounds like someone's having a medical emergency," Maya observed with casual indifference. "These hospitals are so chaotic. It's really not a safe environment for someone in your delicate mental state." Before Sarah could respond, Brandon burst into the room with perfect timing, as if he'd been waiting for his cue. "Sarah, thank God you're awake," he said, ignoring Maya completely. "I have terrible news. There's been a family emergency, and we need to leave immediately." The performance was flawless. Brandon's face showed just the right amount of concern and urgency. Anyone watching would have seen a devoted husband dealing with a crisis while managing his emotionally unstable wife. "What kind of emergency?" Sarah asked. "Your aunt in California," Brandon said smoothly. "She's been in a car accident and she's asking for you. The doctors aren't sure she's going to make it through the night." Sarah felt her world spinning. Her Aunt Patricia was the only remaining connection to her parents, the only family she had left besides Brandon. The idea of losing her while trapped in this nightmare of deception and betrayal was almost unbearable. "I need to see Uncle Richard first," Sarah said. "I need to tell him what's happening." Brandon's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doctor, Sterling is dealing with his own medical emergency right now. He's not available to see patients." The words hit Sarah like ice water. "What do you mean, medical emergency?" "He collapsed in the corridor outside your room," Maya said with false sympathy. "Apparently, he had some sort of cardiac episode. He's in surgery now." The room seemed to tilt around Sarah as she realized the implications. Richard had been her only protector, the only person with the power and resources to stand up to Brandon's criminal connections. Without him, she was completely vulnerable. "We need to go now," Brandon continued. "I've already arranged for your discharge and booked us flights to Los Angeles. Maya can handle the paperwork while you get dressed." Sarah looked between Brandon and Maya, understanding that this was the moment of truth. If she left the hospital with them, she would be completely under their control. Whatever happened to her aunt, this trip would give them the opportunity to isolate her completely from anyone who might help her. "I can't travel," she said desperately. "The baby, my injuries. Dr. Sterling said I needed observation." "Dr. Sterling is fighting for his own life," Brandon replied coldly. "Your attending physician is now Dr. Martinez, and he's already signed your discharge papers. You're medically cleared for travel." As if on cue, a man in scrubs appeared at the door carrying a clipboard. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Martinez. I understand you need to travel for a family emergency. Your husband has explained the situation, and I think it's best for you to be with your family during this difficult time." Sarah realized that even the hospital staff had been compromised. The conspiracy wasn't just Brandon and Maya and Detective Cooper. It extended throughout the system she'd trusted to protect her. "I need to use the bathroom," she said, looking for any chance to escape or call for help. "Of course," Maya said, standing up. "I'll help you. You've been through so much trauma, and you shouldn't be alone right now." As Maya escorted her toward the private bathroom, Sarah caught a glimpse through the open door of her hospital room. Richard's recording device was still on her bedside table, apparently forgotten in the chaos of his medical emergency. If she could get to that device, she would have evidence of Maya's confession and Brandon's conspiracy. But Maya's grip on her arm was firm, and Brandon was watching every move. "You know," Maya said quietly as they walked, "Brandon really does love you. This whole situation has been so hard on him. All he wants is for you to be healthy and happy." The gaslighting continued even now, as Sarah was being kidnapped from the hospital by her own husband. Maya's voice was gentle, caring, designed to make Sarah question her own perceptions one final time. "He just wants what's best for your family," Maya continued. "Sometimes that means making difficult decisions to protect the people we love." Sarah realized that Maya was telling her, in coded language, that Brandon was about to make her disappear. The family emergency was fiction. The trip to California would be one way. Once they got her away from the hospital and any potential witnesses, Sarah Chen Williams would simply vanish. Her baby kicked hard, as if sensing the danger they were both in. Sarah put her hand on her belly and made a silent promise to her daughter somehow, some way, they were going to survive this. But first, she had to figure out how to escape from a hospital surrounded by people who wanted her dead, while her only protector lay unconscious in an operating room down the hall. The next few minutes would determine whether Sarah and her baby lived or died, and she was completely on her own. Sarah's mind raced as Maya guided her toward the bathroom, Brandon's eyes tracking their every movement. The recording device on her bedside table might as well have been on the moon. There was no way to reach it without alerting them to her intentions. But as they passed the nurse's station, Sarah noticed something that gave her hope. Patricia Johnson, the triage nurse who had first treated her, was still on shift. More importantly, Patricia was holding a phone and speaking in the urgent, clipped tones of someone reporting a suspected crime. "Detective Morrison is on his way," Patricia was saying. "Yes, we have concerns about the patient's safety." Sarah realized that Patricia had recognized the signs of domestic abuse and had called for backup when Richard collapsed. There were still people in the hospital who hadn't been compromised, people who were trying to protect her even when she couldn't protect herself. "I need a moment," Sarah said to Maya as they reached the bathroom door. "Please, just give me some privacy." Maya hesitated, clearly reluctant to let Sarah out of her sight. "Of course, but don't take too long. Your flight leaves in 3 hours, and we still need to get you discharged and packed." The moment the bathroom door closed, Sarah pulled out her phone and called the one number she thought might still be safe, the direct line to the hospital's security office. "This is Mrs. Chen Williams in room 714, she whispered. "My husband is trying to force me to leave the hospital against my will. I'm being held by people who want to hurt me." The security guard who answered had obviously been briefed on her situation. "Mrs. Chen Williams, stay exactly where you are. Detective Morrison is in the building, and he's coming to get you now." Hope flared in Sarah's chest, but it was immediately dampened by the sound of Maya's voice outside the door. "Sarah, is everything okay in there? You've been in there for several minutes." "I'm fine," Sarah called back. "Just feeling a bit nauseous. The baby's been very active today." She heard Maya's footsteps moving away, probably to report back to Brandon. Sarah knew she had only minutes before they would force the door open and drag her out of the hospital by whatever means necessary. The bathroom had a small window that looked out onto a fire escape, but Sarah was 7 months pregnant and barely recovered from her head injury. Even if she could fit through the window, she couldn't climb down 3 stories without risking her baby's life. A soft knock on the door made her heart stop. "Mrs. Chen Williams, this is Detective Morrison with the NYPD. I'm here to help you, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you." Sarah cracked the door open and saw a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the confident bearing of someone who had spent years rescuing people from impossible situations. "Detective Morrison," Sarah whispered. "They're trying to take me away. My husband and his girlfriend, and even the other detective. They're all working together." "I know." Morrison said quietly. We've been investigating Detective Cooper for months. He's part of a corruption network that extends throughout the department. But Sarah, I need you to trust me. We're going to walk out of here together, but you have to stay calm no matter what happens. As they opened the bathroom door, Sarah saw that the hospital corridor had transformed into a crime scene. Brandon and Maya were standing near her room, surrounded by uniformed officers. Brandon's face was a mask of rage and desperation, while Maya looked like a trapped animal searching for escape routes. "There she is," Brandon called out as soon as he saw Sarah. "Thank God you found her, Detective. My wife has been having severe psychological episodes, and she's been making wild accusations about people trying to hurt her." Detective Morrison's response was calm and professional. "Mr. Mitchell, you're under arrest for domestic violence, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Maya Rodriguez, you're also under arrest as an accessory to these crimes." The transformation in Brandon's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The charming businessman facade disappeared completely, replaced by something primitive and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he snarled at Morrison. "The people I work for don't accept interference from local cops who think they can play hero. The people you work for are already in federal custody." Morrison replied, "Your criminal syndicate was rolled up this morning in coordinated raids across 3 states. Detective Cooper is cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence." Sarah watched Brandon's world collapse in real time. The powerful criminal network that had seemed invincible just hours ago was crumbling under federal investigation. The corruption that had protected him was being exposed and prosecuted. But Brandon wasn't finished. With the desperate energy of someone with nothing left to lose, he broke free from the officers trying to handcuff him and lunged toward Sarah. "If I can't have you, nobody can," he screamed, his hands reaching for her throat. The attack lasted only seconds before Detective Morrison and the other officers subdued him, but it was long enough for everyone present to see Brandon's true nature. The concerned husband mask had been permanently destroyed, revealing the violent criminal underneath. As Brandon was dragged away in handcuffs, still screaming threats and accusations, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete and total safety. The nightmare was finally over. Maya was led away more quietly, her cold composure cracking as she realized her dreams of replacing Sarah had evaporated along with Brandon's criminal empire. The young woman who had systematically destroyed Sarah's mental health was facing decades in prison for her crimes. "It's over," Detective Morrison said gently. "You're safe now, and your baby is safe. The people who hurt you are going to prison for a very long time." But even as Sarah felt the relief of survival washing over her, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. She had to rebuild her life from nothing, learn to trust her own perceptions again, and prepare to raise her daughter as a single mother. Down the hall, Richard Sterling was fighting for his life in an operating room, his brilliant surgical career potentially ended by the stress of trying to save his goddaughter. The price of Sarah's freedom had been higher than anyone should have to pay. Yet as Sarah felt her baby move inside her, strong and healthy despite everything they'd endured together, she knew they were going to be okay. The truth had finally won out over deception, and justice had prevailed over corruption. The war was over, and Sarah had survived to fight another day. 6 months later, Sarah Chen Williams sat in the sunlit nursery of her new apartment, watching her 3-month-old daughter Emma sleep peacefully in her crib. The morning light streaming through the windows revealed a room painted in soft yellows and greens, decorated with books and toys instead of the designer perfection that had characterized her old life. Richard had survived his heart attack, Though his recovery had been long and difficult, the stress of watching Sarah's ordeal had taken a permanent toll on his health, forcing him into early retirement from surgery. But he'd found new purpose in helping Sarah rebuild her life and being a grandfather to Emma. "She's got your stubborn chin," Richard said from the doorway, his voice still slightly weakened but carrying all the love and pride of a devoted family member. "And your determination," Sarah replied, turning to smile at the man who had literally risked his life to save hers. She kept fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. The legal proceedings had taken months to complete, but justice had ultimately prevailed. Brandon was serving 35 years in federal prison for domestic violence, financial crimes, and conspiracy. The prosecution had been able to use Maya's recorded confession and the evidence of systematic abuse to build an unshakable case. Maya herself had received 15 years for her role in the conspiracy, her youth and cooperation with investigators earning her a somewhat lighter sentence. Detective Cooper was serving 20 years for corruption and obstruction of justice. "Any word from the prosecutor about the restitution?" Richard asked, settling into the rocking chair he'd bought for late-night feedings. "Most of the stolen money was recovered," Sarah said. "Between the frozen accounts and seized assets, I should be able to rebuild financially. But honestly, the money seems less important now than it used to." Sarah had spent the months since her rescue in intensive therapy, working to undo the psychological damage Brandon had inflicted through years of systematic abuse. Learning to trust her own perceptions again had been the hardest part. The gaslighting had been so thorough that Sarah had questioned every thought and feeling for months afterward. But Emma had been her anchor throughout the recovery process. The baby's needs were immediate and real, forcing Sarah to make decisions and trust her maternal instincts. Each successful day of caring for her daughter had rebuilt Sarah's confidence in her own judgment. "I've been thinking about the victim advocacy program," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Richard. "The director called yesterday. They want to offer me a position helping other domestic abuse survivors navigate the legal system." Richard nodded approvingly. "You'd be excellent at that work. You understand what they're going through in a way that most advocates can't." The program would allow Sarah to turn her traumatic experience into something meaningful, helping other women escape the same traps that had nearly destroyed her. The work would be emotionally challenging, but it would also give her purpose beyond simple survival. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," Sarah said, watching Emma's peaceful sleep. "How did I not see what Brandon really was until it was almost too late?" "Because abusers are experts at deception," Richard replied. "They choose their victims carefully and isolate them systematically. What matters isn't how you got trapped, it's how you found the strength to escape." Sarah thought about the universal dilemma that had defined her experience, the choice between safety and truth. So many abuse victims face the same impossible decision: remain silent and survive, or speak out and risk everything. She'd been fortunate to have resources and support that many women didn't possess. The shared experience of motherhood had also been crucial to her recovery. Connecting with other new mothers in support groups had shown Sarah that her fears and uncertainties were normal, not signs of mental instability as Brandon had convinced her. Learning to trust other women again had been essential to healing. "What's the most important thing you want Emma to know when she's old enough to understand?" Richard asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "That she deserves to be treated with respect and love, that her thoughts and feelings matter, that asking questions isn't paranoia, it's wisdom." The wisdom moment that had come from her ordeal was simple, but profound true love doesn't require you to become smaller or quieter or more convenient. It celebrates your strength, supports your growth, and protects your autonomy. Emma would grow up knowing this truth from the beginning. Emma stirred in her crib, making the soft sounds that indicated she would soon be awake and hungry. Sarah stood to pick up her daughter, marveling at how natural motherhood had become despite her fears about raising a child alone. "Hello, beautiful girl," Sarah murmured as Emma opened her eyes. "Mama's here. Mama's always going to be here." As she settled into the nursing chair with Emma, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night in the hospital. The woman who had apologized for existing had become someone who advocated for herself and others. The victim had become a survivor, and the survivor was becoming a warrior for other women facing similar battles. Outside their apartment windows, New York City continued its endless rhythm of movement and change. But inside their small sanctuary, Sarah and Emma existed in a bubble of safety and love that no one could threaten or destroy. The nightmare was truly over, and the rest of their lives stretched ahead like an open road leading toward whatever future they chose to create together. Some stories end with the princess being rescued, but the best ones end with the princess discovering she had the power to save herself all along. Sarah Chen Williams had found that power, and she was never going to give it up again. The millionaire who had pushed his pregnant wife in the hospital was spending his nights in a federal prison cell. But the surgeon who had been her billionaire godfather was reading bedtime stories to his great goddaughter, while her mother planned a future filled with endless possibilities. And in the end, that made all the difference in the world.